A repeater is a piece of communications equipment which can receive a signal on one frequency and simultaneously transmit it out on another frequency. This means a low-power transmitter in someone's car or a handheld radio can transmit on a repeater's input channel, and the signal will be reproduced on the repeater's output channel, increasing the radio's effective transmit and receive range significantly. They are used for maintaining radio contact between two or more stations over larger distances than simplex operation will allow. Repeaters placed on hilltops can allow stations to make contact if terrain or buildings block radio-to-radio communications. But this video is less about how repeaters work and more on the history and rollout of the amateur radio repeater network across the UK. We need to travel back to the early 1970s to trace the history of the UK's amateur radio repeaters. Around this time, 144 MHz was undergoing a transformation, with popular usage moving from AM to narrowband FM. The idea of repeaters fueled the enthusiasm of many radio amateurs in the UK after they heard examples of European repeaters in use. Private mobile radio had already developed the use of commercial repeaters for business and emergency services, and the idea of covering large areas to facilitate portable and mobile working was attractive, especially with new hand-portable and vehicle mobile radios that were becoming available from Japan. A licence was obtained by the RSGB to set up an experimental repeater on 144 MHz, and the GB3PI repeater commenced service from Cambridge. By 1975, there were 6 operational repeaters in the 144 MHz band, with interest amongst other groups for the rollout of a further 10. In October of 1975, the RSGB, who were at this time concerned by the increasing workload that the new repeater network was causing, called a special meeting. The meeting established a repeater working group which was to be directly responsible to the VHF committee. The first task was to prepare plans for the current and future repeater networks on the 144 MHz and 430 MHz bands. Both of these plans were prepared during 1976, with the UHF one being actually first, since the Home Office, who were the licensing authority at the time, had stated that there would be no further licenses issued until a plan was devised. The VHF plan was submitted in the September of 1976. Calculations using the best data available at the time to the RSGB and the Home Office predicted a requirement for 40 repeaters on 144 MHz, and a suggested spacing for units on the same channel was given at 200 miles. UHF repeaters were to be treated as local, small coverage repeaters, and as a guideline it was suggested that the coverage should be based on a 33 km square. To accommodate the various groups who were submitting repeater proposals by the late 1970s, it was decided to categorise proposals into phased batches to be submitted to the Home Office and later the DTI at yearly intervals for each band. A particular phase would refer to either VHF or UHF, and even though Phase 5 may be submitted for 144 MHz, Phase 6 for UHF may be in the process of being collated. The phasing system worked as the chosen way of coordinating repeater input to the authorities until around 1982, when, following discussions with the DTI, who had taken over licensing from the Home Office, it was agreed that they would accept 2 combined batches per year at 6 monthly intervals. This ultimately meant that long licensing delays were experienced, up to and over 2 years in some cases, so discussions took place between the RSGB and the DTI with a view to improving the situation, and this led to the DTI reviewing applications monthly from 1986. By 1982, most of the country south of the Pennines was covered, especially on VHF, and doubts were being expressed as to whether any new units would be able to be allocated suitable channel allocations. There were a number of cases of interference from repeaters on the same channel, but most were caused by either fixed station working or people attempting to access a repeater outside of its normal coverage area. The UHF repeater network was well established, with both speech and data repeaters, although its use and expansion in the north was much less than in the south. By the mid to late 1980s, there were numerous plans and experiments being discussed, such as the 1.3 GHz band being introduced to repeaters, with the licensing of both speech and TV repeaters. In addition, a licence was granted for an experimental pilot SSB repeater in Sheffield, as well as an experiment in packet data switches and experimental 29 MHz repeaters. There were ideas floating around for linking VHF and UHF repeaters as early as the late 1980s to improve coverage area as well as the expansion of the network. By the end of the 1980s, there were over 75 licensed repeaters on 2 metres and over 150 on 70 centimetres, and their use was becoming more and more popular. The future of repeaters in the UK was looking bright at this time, and the expansion of the network continued and still does to this day. Although technology's vastly changed, repeaters are a simple tool that provide large coverage over towns, cities and challenging terrains that make simplex working almost impossible. So that is a potted history of how the VHF and UHF repeater networks came into use for amateur radio in the UK. And like most things, repeaters rely on donations, whether it be through a repeater group or privately. Although the number of repeaters seems to be growing, the number of users seems to be declining, so it's really important that the repeaters are used. If they're not used, then they'll be lost. So if you are a regular repeater user, then make sure you look up the repeater group and consider joining.